Just that I was going through a huge amount of depression after my mother died.
I would like to try it one day, but I think...
Why was I still in this terrible black hole where...
I think I'm going to wait until people are not so concerned about seeing George Michael. And
more freaked that it wasn't going to stop, that it wasn't going to end.
It's a real, you know, get your teeth into it, Greek name.
Something disastrous was my fault, you know?
Listen. No music, no applause, no screaming crowds, just silence. Strange, isn't it?
I would like to try it one day, but I think I'm going to wait until people are not so concerned about seeing George Michael, and also until people stop offering me lousy parts.
For a man whose voice filled stadiums, whose songs became the soundtrack to millions of lives, silence is probably the last thing you'd expect. But sometimes, silence tells us more than applause ever could.
My own real name. Yeah. It's a real, you know, get your teeth into it, Greek name. Yorgos Kyriakou Banayotou.
The world knew him as George Michael, the global superstar, the hitmaker, the heartthrob, the voice behind Careless Whisper, Faith, Freedom, 90, and some of the biggest songs of a generation.
It's just that I was going through a huge amount of depression after my mother died that was kind of masked by the whole outside, you know, the whole arrest thing.
He had the fame, the fortune, the admiration of millions. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life. But behind the music, behind the headlines, behind one of the most recognizable faces in the world, was a man carrying a question that fame could never answer. What does it really mean to be free?
And in a way, fighting for my reputation, that was a great distraction for me.
This isn't just the story of George Michael. It's the story of a man who spent much of his life trying to escape the version of himself the world had created. Because sometimes, the hardest prison to leave is the one built by everyone else's expectations.
Although I wasn't very worried about that.
This is George Michael, the man behind the music, before the sold-out stadiums, before the platinum records, before millions of people sang his songs. There was simply a boy named Georgios Kyriakos Banayotou. He was born on June 25th, 1963, in East Finchley, North London.
Time in maybe, I don't know, 10 years, best part of 10 years, something disastrous was my fault. You know, it was like, and I could possibly do something about it. Right.
His father was a Greek Cypriot immigrant who had worked tirelessly to build a better life for his family. His mother was an English dancer whose warmth and encouragement helped shape George's love of music. From an early age, George never quite felt like he belonged. He was shy, quiet, painfully self-conscious.
Had what, you know, obviously what we call writer's block, and more freaked that it wasn't going to stop, that it wasn't going to end. I was not going to be able to make the next album that I needed to make.
As a teenager, he struggled with his appearance and often lacked confidence. He would later admit that he never imagined himself becoming the kind of person people would admire. But life is a strange way of introducing us to the people who change everything.
Why was I still in this terrible black hole when I had someone by my side who was trying to help me through it, you know?
At school, George met a boy named Andrew Ridgeley. The two couldn't have been more different. Andrew was confident, outgoing, fearless. George was thoughtful, reserved, more comfortable expressing himself through music than words. Yet together, they formed a friendship that would alter the course of both their lives.
But bereavement is a very strange thing. It's different for everybody, I suppose.
They shared an obsession with music, endless conversations about artists they admired, dreams that seemed far too ambitious for two teenagers from North London. Like so many young musicians, they weren't chasing fame. They were chasing possibility. In bedrooms, garages, and small rehearsal spaces, George discovered something remarkable. He wasn't just a good singer. He had an extraordinary gift, a voice capable of conveying power, vulnerability, and emotion in equal measure. But perhaps his greatest talent wasn't his voice at all. It was his ability to write songs that felt deeply personal, yet somehow belonged to everyone who heard them. Long before the world knew his name, George was already writing about longing, love, heartbreak, hope, freedom, themes that would follow him throughout his entire career. Then, in the early 1980s, everything changed. George and Andrew formed a pop duo called Wham. What began as two friends with impossible dreams was about to become one of the biggest musical success stories of the decade. Neither of them could have imagined what was waiting on the other side, because with extraordinary success came extraordinary expectations. And for George, those expectations would become increasingly difficult to escape. By the early 1980s, George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley were no longer two teenagers with impossible dreams. They had become Wham, Bright, colorful, energetic, everything the decade seemed to represent. Their music was impossible to ignore. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go. Freedom. Everything She Wants. Hit after hit, the world couldn't get enough. But while audiences saw effortless confidence, George was already proving something remarkable. He wasn't simply the lead singer. He was becoming one of the finest songwriters of his generation. Long before critics recognized it, George understood something few pop stars ever master. Great songs don't just entertain. They tell the truth, even when the person singing them isn't ready to. Then, in 1984, something extraordinary happened. George released a song he had written almost by accident, a saxophone riff, a melody that refused to leave his mind. A song called Careless Whisper. It became a global phenomenon. #1 in country after country, selling millions of copies, becoming one of the most recognizable songs ever recorded. And suddenly, George Michael wasn't simply part of Wham. He had become a star in his own right. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Magazine covers, television interviews, concert arenas filled with thousands of screaming fans. It seemed like the perfect life. But success is a strange habit. The bigger you become, the more the world begins telling you who you're supposed to be. To millions of fans, George wasn't Georgios anymore. He wasn't simply a songwriter. He had become an image, the handsome pop idol, the perfect heartthrob, the fantasy, and fantasies are difficult to escape. In 1986, at the very height of Wham's success, George made a decision that shocked the music industry. He walked away. Most artists spend their lives trying to reach the top. George had reached it and chose to leave. To many people, it made no sense. Why walk away from one of the biggest bands in the world? But for George, the answer was becoming impossible to ignore. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life playing a character. He wanted to be taken seriously. As a songwriter, as a musician, as an artist, he wasn't running away from success. He was running toward authenticity. And he was about to discover that becoming your true self often comes at a price. By 1987, George Michael stood alone. Wham had become history. Now, the entire world was waiting to see whether he could succeed without it. He didn't just succeed. He exploded. His debut solo album, Faith, became one of the defining records of its generation. Hit after hit climbed the charts. Faith, Father Figure, One More Try, Monkey. Around the world, millions of copies were sold. George Michael wasn't simply a pop star anymore. He had become one of the biggest artists on the planet. Awards followed. Stadium tours followed. Fame reached a level few musicians ever experienced. Once again, it looked like the dream had come true. But beneath the success, George was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The world celebrated the image, the leather jacket, the sunglasses, the carefully crafted confidence. Yet the more successful that image became, the less it reflected the man behind it. George wasn't interested in becoming a brand. He wanted to be respected as a songwriter, as a musician, as someone whose work mattered beyond magazine covers and posters on bedroom walls. Then, in 1990, he did something almost unheard of. Instead of putting himself at the center of his biggest new music video, he disappeared. In the video for Freedom, 90, George Michael never appeared. There were no close-ups, no performance, no attempt to sell the image that had made him famous. Instead, supermodels became the faces of the song. The leather jacket burned. The jukebox exploded. Symbols of the image he wanted to leave behind were destroyed before the audience's eyes. To many people, it looked like an artistic decision. But perhaps it was something much deeper. George wasn't rejecting his fans. He wasn't rejecting his music. He was rejecting the version of himself that other people expected him to remain. It was a bold decision. But freedom often demands courage. And courage almost always comes with consequences. Record executives questioned him. The media speculated. Some fans struggled to understand. Yet George refused to turn back. For the first time in his career, he wasn't asking, "What does the world want from me?" He was asking, "Who do I want to become?" It was a question that would shape the rest of his life. Because the hardest part of finding freedom isn't walking away from the past. It's accepting that not everyone will follow you into the future. By the 1990s, George Michael had achieved something few artists ever do. He had stopped living for other people's expectations. But freedom doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. Behind the music, George was carrying heartbreak that few people truly understood. In 1997, his mother, Leslie, passed away after a battle with cancer. The loss devastated him. She had been one of the most important people in his life, his greatest supporter, his safe place. Friends would later say that a part of George never fully recovered. Yet while he was grieving, the world continued watching. Every appearance became a headline. Every mistake became front-page news. Every private struggle became public conversation. In 1998, George found himself at the center of worldwide attention following his arrest in Los Angeles. Overnight, the headlines wrote their own version of his story. Jokes replaced understanding. Speculation replaced compassion. But something remarkable happened. Instead of hiding, George chose honesty. He spoke openly about his sexuality, not because it was easy, but because pretending had become harder. It wasn't a publicity campaign. It wasn't a carefully planned announcement. It was simply the moment when living truthfully became more important than protecting an image. And in many ways, that decision reflected the journey he had been on for years. A journey toward authenticity, toward freedom. Yet there was another side to George Michael, one the public rarely saw. Away from the cameras, he quietly gave away millions of dollars. He paid for medical treatments, supported charities, helped struggling families, donated anonymously to people who never realized who had changed their lives. He didn't announce it. He didn't seek applause. In many cases, those acts of kindness only became known after his death. Perhaps that tells us more about George Michael than any headline ever could. Because generosity isn't measured by how many people see it. It's measured by what you choose to do when nobody is watching. To the public, George Michael was one of the biggest stars in the world. But to countless strangers, he was simply someone who appeared in their darkest moment and quietly made life a little easier. Maybe that's a version of George that deserves to be remembered most. George Michael's life can be measured in many ways. More than 100 million records sold, countless awards, sold-out stadiums across the world, songs that continue to echo through generations. By almost every measure, he was one of the greatest artists of his time. But perhaps those achievements tell only part of the story. George once spent years trying to become the person the world expected him to be. The pop idol, the heartthrob, the superstar. Yet over time, he discovered something that many of us spend our entire lives learning. Real freedom isn't found in applause. It isn't found in fame. It isn't found in success. It begins the moment you stop asking, who do people want me to be? And start asking, who am I really? George's journey wasn't perfect. He experienced heartbreak, loss, public judgment, moments of profound loneliness. But through it all, he never stopped writing honestly, never stopped giving generously, never stopped searching for something real. Perhaps that's why his music still resonates today, because beneath every melody was a man trying to understand himself. And maybe that's why millions of people still feel connected to him, not because he was perfect, but because he was human. Long after the headlines fade, long after the awards gather dust, long after the final encore, his songs remain, not simply because they were beautifully written, but because they spoke to something honest, something vulnerable, something deeply human. George Michael reminded us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes, courage is choosing authenticity, even when the world would prefer the performance. Perhaps that is the legacy he leaves behind, not just unforgettable music, but the quiet reminder that the greatest freedom any of us can ever find is the freedom to be ourselves. Because behind every legend, there is a human being. Behind every song, there is a story. And behind every spotlight, there is someone hoping to be seen. Not for who the world expects them to be, but for who they truly are. This was George Michael, not just one of the greatest voices of generation, but a man whose greatest journey was learning to live as himself,